And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Greetings, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Saturday, February 1st. And starting with the sea ice, we have the ice now running down along the southwest coast, though with this push of milder air and the storm track shifting back from the North Pacific out across the Bering. We're going to see more in the way of mild southerly flow along the west coast, so this will cause some melting along the ice edge, as well as the ice to gradually retreat northward in the week ahead, because this pattern is not going to change anytime soon. We have a big high pressure sitting way over northwest Canada, and then the storm track reestablishing itself from the North Pacific up into the Bering and along eastern Asia, eastern Russia, with fronts brushing the west coast. And here we have that scenario late tonight into Sunday morning. We have a 971 low entering here the western Bering. Southerly flow out ahead of it. We have this big Arctic high over northwest Canada. That has the sub-zero temperatures, the cold outflow winds along the panhandle, and then this warmer surface reflection. There's a ridge of warmer air in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere coming in up over this area. And this is the surface reflection of that, different from a cold Arctic high. This Arctic high above 1050 millibars for Sunday afternoon. And then back to the west, we have the low continuing up through the western Bering, so that by Monday, this feature will be working its way across eastern Russia. This trough or remnants of a front will create some gusty winds and areas of snow and blowing snow, especially along the western and northern Seward Peninsula and areas like Kivalina up to Point Hope and Cape Lisburne. So on the weather map, or I should say for the marine outlook here for Sunday, the Panhandle, Lynn Canal, north winds 30 knots, waves as high as 12-14 feet. Northerly winds 30 knots there, Stevens Passage with 12-foot waves. Dixon Entrance, north winds around 20-25 knots with 7-foot waves. But notice the outflow winds out of the northeast along the Gulf Coast there, the outer coast of the Panhandle. Some of the stronger winds of 35 knots there south of Sitka and up toward the Icy Strait, with waves in those areas as high as 8 to maybe 10 feet. On Monday, winds will continue, outflow winds out of the north for the inner channels, 25 to 30 knots, waves still about 9-10 feet there, especially south end of Lynn Canal, 8-9 feet there, Stevens Passage, 6 feet, Dixon Entrance, and then for areas of the northeastern Gulf, Cape Suckling to Yakutat Bay, 10 to 15 knot north winds, but we could find winds upwards of 30 knots from the northeast, especially from Sitka southward down to Craig. For the northwestern portion of the Gulf, variable winds 10 knots, but notice out of the Copper River Delta, north winds, northeast winds 30 with gusts to 45 knots, those cold outflow winds there. And then as we go down through Lower Cook Inlet, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, waves 4 to 5 feet. For Monday, winds will decrease there out of the Copper River Basin. Variable winds around Prince William Sound outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance at 10 knots. Look for northwest winds, middle and Lower Cook Inlet off of Anchor Point down toward Kennedy Entrance. Areas around Kodiak Island, variable winds 10 knots, Shelikof Strait. Otherwise, westerly winds, Akiak to Chiknik there at 15 knots. As we go, Bristol Bay, east winds 10 knots, but the winds turn back southeasterly, and we're looking at 20 to 25 knot winds. Waves could be as high as 8 feet there off of False Pass. And then Monday, look for southwest winds 15 knots within Shelikof Strait, northwest winds on the east side of Kodiak Island, variable winds only 10 knots within Bristol Bay. But again, still a southeasterly wind 15 to 20 knots, especially through the lower half or thirds there of the peninsula. On Sunday, because of the general storm track coming out of the North Pacific up into the western Bering, we have southerly or southeasterly flow. Southeasterly gales 35 to 40 knots over the eastern Aleutians. There's a little bit of a lull, south winds to 20 knots there between Atka and Adak, and then they pick back up again 30 to 35 knots, especially west-northwest of Adak through Kiska and Shemya. And then for Monday, those winds will come down a bit. There's another low further south, and southeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots will be common over the eastern half of the Aleutians. As we get further west, south-southeast winds around 15 to maybe 20 knots. Along the southwest coast Sunday, We find within Kuskokwim Bay, southeast winds 25 knots, east winds 15 knots. Bristol Bay, 35 knot gale. St. Matthew through the Pribilovs with waves 16 to 19 feet. This ice is going to have a tendency to start to try to drift back northward. Southeast winds through the lower Yukon Delta, 25 knots, 20 knots there within Norton Sound. And then on Monday, winds come down there. Bristol Bay, easterly 10 knots. Southeast winds within Kuskokwim Bay, 20 knots. But 30 knot southerly flow from St. Matthew to along the lower Yukon Delta up toward Nome. So again, the tendency will be for the ice to retreat a bit with these milder temperatures, some melting along the ice edge because temperatures in those areas will be at least in the mid-30s. And then across the north through the Bering Strait, winds will be southeast to south 30 knots into the lower Chukchi Sea, and generally south winds all along the Beaufort Sea coast, though not as strong, 10 to 15 knots, Utqiagvik to Kaktovik. And on Monday, we expect still some stronger gale force, 35 knots south-southeast winds, lower Chukchi Sea down through the Bering Strait. Areas like Cape Lisburne Point, Hope, Kivalliq, there could be some reduced visibility due to snow and blowing snow, and also down through the Bering Strait. We're looking at southerly winds, 35 knots, and again, air temperatures are going to be right around or a bit above freezing here to start off the week in these areas of the Bering Strait.